alien hypothesis was always a comfort. It meant the phenomenon was just us, but further along. The truth may be stranger. The extraterrestrial hypothesis is elegant. It requires no new physics, no new ontology, just more of what we already know. Intelligent beings evolving somewhere else, developing technology, crossing space to visit. It fits our cultural expectations. It matches our science fiction. It is, in a deep sense, conservative. And it may be wrong. Not wrong in the sense that the phenomenon isn't real. We've established it is. Not wrong in the sense that non-human intelligence isn't involved. It almost certainly is. Wrong in the sense that the extraterrestrial framework, beings from another planet, traveling in spacecraft, visiting Earth, may fundamentally misunderstand what we're dealing with. If there was a patron saint of taking the phenomenon seriously while refusing easy answers, it is Jacques Vallee. Vallée is a peculiar figure in this field. A computer scientist who worked on ARPANET, the precursor to the internet. An astronomer who helped NASA map Mars. A venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. These are not the credentials of a crank. They are the credentials of someone embedded in the most rigorous technical institutions of the modern world. And yet, Vallée has spent 50 years arguing that the extraterrestrial hypothesis is too simple, that the phenomenon is stranger than spacecraft from Zeta Reticuli, that we are not dealing with visitors from another place, but with something woven into the structure of reality itself. In 1969, Vallée published a book that changed the conversation, Passport to Magonia. It didn't argue that UFOs were real. That case had been made. It argued that UFOs were old. Vallée assembled a catalogue of encounters across history. Medieval accounts of airships, Renaissance reports of strange beings, Celtic folklore about faeries, and biblical visions of wheels within wheels. The specifics varied. The beings wore different costumes, rode different vehicles, and spoke different languages. But the structure of the encounters was consistent. People reported contact with non-human intelligences. And these intelligences demonstrated impossible capabilities. They communicated in ways that mixed the profound with the absurd. They left witnesses changed, often traumatized, rarely with anything to show for it. The faeries of Irish folklore behaved remarkably like the aliens of 1950s contactee reports. The incubi and succubi of medieval demonology had features in common with modern abduction accounts. And the airship mystery of 1896 to 97, in which Americans across the country reported seeing cigar-shaped craft piloted by strange beings, predated powered human flight. Vallee's argument was not that all these phenomena were identical. It was that they shared a morphology, a shape, a pattern that transcended the specific cultural vocabulary used to describe them. The phenomenon adapts. It wears the costume appropriate to its era. Chariots of fire for ancient Hebrews, fairy processions for medieval Celts, and flying saucers for mid-century Americans. What remains constant is not the appearance, but the experience. Contact with something other, something that shouldn't be there, something that operates outside normal rules. If the phenomenon were simply extraterrestrial visitation, this historical pattern makes no sense. Why would aliens from another star system appear as faeries in medieval Ireland? Why would their craft resemble 19th century airships before evolving into flying discs? Either there have been multiple alien civilizations visiting Earth across millennia, each coincidentally resembling that era's expectations, or the phenomenon itself is more fundamental than any particular appearance. Vallée went further. In The Invisible College and subsequent works, he proposed what he called the control system hypothesis. The phenomenon, he suggested, functions like a thermostat, not for temperature, but for belief. It operates as a regulatory mechanism on human consciousness and culture, appearing in ways that challenge our current worldview just enough to shift it, without ever providing the definitive proof that would collapse uncertainty into certainty. Consider the pattern. The phenomenon never quite lands on the White House lawn. It never quite provides incontrovertible evidence. It dances at the edge of credibility, real enough to be impossible to dismiss entirely, but ambiguous enough to be impossible to confirm definitively. This is not what we would expect from a straightforward extraterrestrial visitation. It is what we would expect from something that wants to affect human belief without being fully understood. What would such a control system be for? Vallée speculates that it may be nudging human development, technologically, psychologically, and spiritually. The appearance of the phenomenon correlates with moments of cultural transition. It intensified around the dawn of the nuclear age. It has intensified again around the development of artificial intelligence. And it appears when we approach thresholds. A control system would explain why the phenomenon remains elusive, why it adapts to cultural expectations, and why it seems to know more about us than straightforward visitors would. It would explain the intelligence behind the phenomenon. Not just technological intelligence, but strategic intelligence about human psychology. The Gnostic Archons, it should be noted, were also control systems. They regulated the boundaries of the spheres. They monitored what passed through and what stayed confined. They weren't random entities. They were structural, part of the architecture that maintained the demiurge's order. When Vallée proposes a control system embedded in reality itself, monitoring and adjusting human development, he is describing something the Gnostics might recognize. He is just using different vocabulary. Now, if the phenomenon is not simply visitors from another planet, what is it? One possibility that has gained traction among researchers and among intelligence analysts, even among some physicists, is that the phenomenon originates not from another place in our space, but from another kind of space, another dimension, an orthogonal reality. The concept requires a thought experiment. Imagine a creature living in a two-dimensional world, a flatland, to use Edwin Abbott's famous metaphor. This creature can move forward and backward, left and right, but it has no concept of up and down. Its universe is a plane. Now imagine a three-dimensional being, you, interacting with Flatland. If you poked your finger through the plane, the Flatlander would see something miraculous. A circle appearing from nowhere, changing size as your finger moved through, then vanishing as you withdrew. The circle would seem to violate Flatland physics. It would appear and disappear without traversing the intervening space. It would change shape without apparent cause. From the Flatlander's perspective, you would be impossible. From your perspective, you would simply be pointing. The interdimensional hypothesis proposes that the phenomenon may be the equivalent of a three-dimensional finger poking through our four-dimensional space-time. The objects that appear and disappear, that accelerate instantaneously, and that seem to violate our physics, they may not be violating physics at all. They may be operating in dimensions we cannot perceive, with our observations representing the limited cross-section of higher dimensional activity. It's a direct application of concepts from theoretical physics. String theory proposes that our reality may have 10, 11, or more spatial dimensions, with most of them compactified, curled up at scales too small to observe directly. But compactified doesn't mean inaccessible in principle. If beings or technologies existed that could manipulate higher dimensional geometry, their interactions with our three-dimensional experience could appear exactly like what the phenomenon demonstrates. Instantaneous acceleration? Not if you're not actually moving through our space, but through a dimension orthogonal to it. Disappearance and reappearance? Well, not if you're withdrawing from and re-entering the cross-section we call reality. And the trans-medium travel? Not relevant if the medium is a lower dimensional projection and you are moving in the dimension where air and water are the same thing. The interdimensional hypothesis doesn't solve the mystery. It reframes it. We go from asking, where do they come from, to asking, what is the structure of reality that allows this? There is a version of the interdimensional hypothesis that is even stranger, the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis. It proposes that the intelligence behind the phenomenon is not visiting from elsewhere, but that it has always been here. It shares our planet, perhaps shares our reality, but occupies a domain we cannot normally perceive. John Keel, the journalist who investigated the Mothman sightings and other high strangeness events, was one of the early proponents of this view. The aliens in his framework were not aliens at all. They were native to Earth, or at least native to whatever substrate Earth exists within. They preceded us, and they will outlast us. We're not being visited, we're being observed by something that lives next door in a room we don't have eyes to see. This might sound like a throwback to demonology, to fairy lore, to the mythological worldview that modernity displaced. And in a sense, it is. But that's precisely Vallee's point in Passport to Magonia. The mythological worldview might have been describing something real, using the only vocabulary available. The Demiurge's cosmos, in Gnostic thought, was populated by the Archons, beings who were neither human nor divine, neither wholly material nor wholly spiritual. They were native to the construction, and they had power within it. They monitored and managed the beings trapped within. If the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis is correct, then the phenomenon may be the modern phase of something very old. Not visitors, but cohabitants, administrators. There's one feature of the phenomenon that doesn't fit either the extraterrestrial or the interdimensional hypothesis cleanly. It's the connection to consciousness. UFO encounters, especially close encounters, are weird in ways that go beyond unusual aircraft. Witnesses report telepathic communication, messages received directly in the mind without spoken words. They report precognition, knowing the encounter would happen before it did. And they report time distortions, hours passing in what felt like minutes, or vice versa. They report synchronicities, meaningful coincidences clustering around the event, and psychological changes, altered beliefs, new abilities, and ongoing contact with the phenomenon through dreams or visions. Is that really what we would expect from a straightforward encounter with advanced technology? If a helicopter would land in your yard and the pilot spoke to you, you would not expect to develop psychic abilities, experience missing time, or receive telepathic messages for years afterward. The psychic components of the phenomenon have led many researchers to suspect that whatever is happening involves consciousness directly, not just as the witness perceiving an external event, but as a participant in or even target of the encounter. Whitley Strieber, the author of Communion and numerous other accounts of his own experiences, has argued that the phenomenon cannot be understood through a purely materialist lens. The visitors interact with consciousness in ways that suggest they are made of something consciousness adjacent, or that the boundary between physical and psychological is not where we think it is. This makes some researchers deeply uncomfortable. The credibility of the phenomenon, hard-won through radar evidence and pilot testimony, seems threatened by talk of telepathy and synchronicity. Adding psychic to UFO feels like doubling down on fringe territory. But the data includes what the data includes, and the psychic components are there, consistently across independent reports. Ignoring them to maintain credibility is not science, it is public relations. There's another possibility, stranger still. If consciousness is fundamental, and if the idealist or panpsychist philosophers are correct, then the relationship between observer and phenomenon might be bidirectional in ways materialism doesn't permit. Earlier, we discussed the observer effect in quantum mechanics, Hoffman's interface theory, and if the world is computed, the computation might respond to observation. What if the phenomenon is the observer effect, but on a much larger scale? What if the phenomenon is what happens when consciousness pushes against the boundaries of the interface? What if the appearances, the craft, the beings, the messages are shaped by the observer as much as by whatever is being observed? Not in the sense that witnesses are hallucinating, but in the sense that the phenomenon itself has no fixed form and takes form in the act of being perceived. This would explain the costume changes across eras. Not different visitors, but the same underlying something, crystallizing into different shapes depending on the cultural matrix of the observer. The Celts saw faeries because they expected them, and mid-century Americans saw saucers because saucers were in the cultural imagination. And what we see now, the tic-tacs, the triangles, the transmedium orbs, is what our current consciousness can render. This is the most difficult hypothesis to evaluate, because it undermines the very distinction between subject and object that normal investigation requires. But it may also be the most consonant with what the phenomenon actually does. The phenomenon appears, it demonstrates impossibility, it vanishes, and it leaves witnesses changed. It never quite proves itself. It never quite goes away. That's not the behavior of a spacecraft. That's the behavior of something that exists at the boundary between mind and world. Something that shows up precisely at the edge of what we can conceptualize and recedes as we try to grasp it. There's one more feature of the phenomenon we cannot ignore, though it causes considerable embarrassment to those trying to make UFOs respectable: the absurdity. Close encounter reports are often ridiculous. Beings offer witnesses pancakes. They ask for water, then pour it on themselves. They make pronouncements that sound profound but dissolve into nonsense on examination. And they behave in ways that seem designed to humiliate the witness, to make any report sound crazy, to contaminate the signal with noise. This has led debunkers to dismiss the phenomenon as confabulation, misremembered dreams, and psychological projection. If aliens were real, they would be dignified. They would make sense. They would behave like the aliens in our movies. But the pattern of absurdity is too consistent to be random. It appears across independent reports, across cultures, and across centuries. The faeries play tricks too. The trickster element seems to be a feature, not a bug. Vallée has suggested that the absurdity is functional. It serves to protect the phenomenon from premature closure. If every encounter were clear and coherent, it could be analyzed, categorized, and understood, and thereby tamed. The absurdity keeps the phenomenon open, underdetermined, resistant to the kind of understanding that would reduce it to another item in our inventory of known things. And this is, of course, exactly how a gnostic would expect archontic forces to behave. Not straightforwardly malevolent, that would be too clear, and not helpful, that would enable escape. It's confusing, it's boundary maintaining, keeping the prisoners too uncertain to mount a coordinated response. Though there is a more benevolent reading. In many spiritual traditions, the trickster is a teacher. Coyote in Native American mythology, Loki in Norse, Hermes in Greek. These figures violate expectations not to harm, but to awaken, to jolt consciousness out of its habitual patterns into a new way of seeing. If the phenomenon is trying to teach us, if part of its purpose is to expand human consciousness, to prepare us for something, then confusion might be the method. You cannot teach someone to see beyond their categories by speaking in those categories. You have to break the frame. You have to present something that doesn't fit, so that the inability to make it fit forces the recognition that the frame is too small. The Gnostic path was always uncomfortable. Gnosis is not a comfortable knowing. It's the vertigo of recognizing that what you thought was real is a constructed appearance. The phenomenon, with its absurdity, its impossibility, its refusal to be pinned down, may be inducing exactly that vertigo. not cruelly, not pointlessly, but towards some end we cannot yet see. But where does this leave us? Certainly not with answers, but with better questions. The extraterrestrial hypothesis, visitors from another planet traveling in spacecraft, may be true for some subset of the phenomenon, but it cannot account for the historical pattern, the psychic components, and the absurdity, the consciousness connection, the adaptive alteration of what its costumes are. It is too simple. It treats the phenomenon as just another thing in this world, when the phenomenon may be pointing at the structure of the world itself. The interdimensional hypothesis opens more space. It allows for beings or intelligences that interact with our reality from outside its normal parameters, appearing and disappearing, demonstrating physics we can't replicate, operating according to rules we do not understand. This fits the behavioral data better, but it raises questions about what dimension means and how such interaction is possible. The ultra-terrestrial hypothesis goes further. These intelligences may not be visitors at all, but cohabitants, something native to our world, or to the substrate our world rests on, that has been here all along. This is the closest to the Archon concept, and the most disturbing. It suggests we are not alone, we have never been alone, and that there's something else has its own agenda. The consciousness hypothesis goes furthest. The phenomenon may not be separate from consciousness at all, but may exist at the interface between mind and reality, taking form in the act of observation, shaped by what we expect and believe even as it shapes what we can expect and believe. None of these are proven. All of them are consistent with the data in ways the simple alien story is not. But what they share is a common implication. The phenomenon is not a problem to be solved and filed away. It is a signal that our model of reality is incomplete. The walls of the prison glimpsed at the edge of perception. The Archons wearing new costumes but playing the same role. In our next video, we will examine the Archon parallel directly. The Gnostic descriptions of intermediary powers, guardians of thresholds, enforcers of limits, map disturbingly well onto the phenomenon's behavior. This may be coincidence. It may be convergent pattern recognition. Or it may be that the Gnostics 2000 years ago were describing what we are now beginning to document with radar and infrared cameras. The phenomenon watches, it demonstrates, and it refuses explanation. It waits to see what we will do.